It is a sad fact that war produces dangers beyond the battlefield and casualties beyond the soldiers sent to fight the war. During the United States Civil War, the production of powder and explosive was often left to the most vulnerable among us, young women and small children whose labor was needed when so many men had been sent off to war. It was dangerous work, and that was illustrated in September of 1862 when an explosion at the Allegheny Arsenal near Pittsburgh killed 78 workers, most of them young women engaged in producing cartridges where their delicate hands made them favored workers. But it was not the only such incident during the war. On Friday, March 13th, 1863, it was the Confederates' turn to experience a munitions disaster in the Confederate capital of Richmond. Perhaps the most important Civil War officer that you never heard of is Josiah Gorgas, the Chief of Ordnance for the Confederacy. An 1841 graduate of the United States Military Academy, Gorgas was a Pennsylvanian who, nonetheless, in 1861 left the U.S. Army to join the Confederacy. His work was cut out for him. Civil War historian Jeffrey D. Wirt wrote on the website HistoryNet in 2018, Gorgas faced an enormous undertaking. The South lacked, with few exceptions, the industrial base to manufacture gunpowder, arms, and cannons. In 1864, Gorgas noted the situation he had been faced with when he was appointed in his journal. Within the limits of the Confederate States, there were no arsenals at which any of the material of war was constructed. All of the work of preparation of material had been carried on in the North. Not an arm, not a gun carriage, and except during the Mexican War, scarcely a round of ammunition had for 50 years been prepared in the Confederate States. No powder, save perhaps for blasting, had been made at the South. There was no saltpeter in store at any southern point. It was stored wholly in the North. The Facebook page of Shiloh National Military Park noted in 2018 that when the Confederate States seceded in 1861, their entire supply of the gunpowder was barely enough for 1 month of military operations. There was little ammunition of any kind or powder in Southern arsenals in the South, and that was left over from the Mexican War. It was estimated that less than 1 million rounds of small arm cartridges existed in the Confederacy. It is an enormous credit to Gorgas and his subordinates, notably chemist George Rains, that the Confederacy was able to develop an arms industry that could supply the Confederate armies. While these industries were developed throughout the South, one important location was the Richmond Arsenal. Wirt writes, the Richmond Arsenal served as the headquarters for the Ordnance Bureau and produced nearly half of the Confederacy's ordnance needs. The arsenal produced all manner of arms, cannons, rifles, pistols, sabers, but also ammunition at the Confederate States Laboratory. The Ordnance Laboratory was originally located at a tobacco factory at 7th and Arch Streets, owned by James Thomas, where a July 1861 edition of the Richmond Whig reported that about 370 women and girls are now employed in making cartridges. The making of powder always includes a level of risk. On July 4th, 1861, the Richmond Dispatch reported that untimely, sudden, and horrible death of chemist Joseph Laidley by the explosion of a quantity of detonating powder, which he and an assistant named Robert Clayton of Manchester were preparing for the use of the Confederate Army, in a building erected especially for their use on an eminence in the rear of the state armory and equidistant between that and Thomas's factory, where cartridges are now being fabricated for the government. 4 days later, the Richmond Dispatch reported on risks at the factory itself. A correspondent says, some 2 weeks ago I visited Thomas's factory, where they were making cartridges, some 200 or 300 men, women, and miners, with powder sprinkled all over the floors, and the workmen passing in and out with nails in their shoes. Don't be astonished to hear of that part of the town blowed to the devil. Although the paper posted a rebuttal on the 13th stating the utmost care is taken to prevent accidents and the stringent regulations governing such places are rigidly enforced by the officers in charge. Still, even the rebuttal admitted the preparation of all implements for the destruction of human life involves a certain degree of peril. The peril remained evident. The Whig reported that on the morning of September 26th, a pile of rubbish in the yard attached to the Confederate Laboratory on Bird Street, near the Petersburg Depot, took fire, as it is supposed from a spark from a passing locomotive. And as the pile contained a small quantity of powder, swept at different times from the floors of the building, the combustion was very rapid and somewhat alarming. Obviously, a fire outside a munitions factory is a concern, and the Whig reported it spread consternation among the 200 or 300 women and girls employed at the laboratory in making cartridges, and a stampede from the building took place. Fortunately, the fire was soon extinguished, and the operatives returned to their work, though we dare say some of them were so badly frightened that they will be disposed to seek some other mode of earning a livelihood. The Whig calculated the risk. It matters not how carefully the managers of the laboratory may be, it is a dangerous place, filled as it is with powder and surrounded by furnaces, forges, and steam engines. We adhere to the opinion, expressed some time ago, that the labor employed in making cartridges should be divided, so that in the event of an explosion, the loss of life would not be so great. It is risking too much to congregate several hundred people in one building, exposed as that is, to the possibility of a grand blow-up. Accidents continued. On January 28th, the dispatch reported another explosion occurred yesterday, about 12 o'clock, at the Seacoast Ammunition Room of the Confederate Laboratory Buildings, near the Petersburg Depot, by which several of the workmen engaged there were dreadfully burned. Peter Branders was filling a fuse at the time, which by some means exploded, the sparks therefore igniting about 300 or 400 fuses, which exploded, breaking all the windows in one story of the building and dreadfully burning 5 or 6 of the inmates. The injury to 6 workers was terrible, but the dispatch noted that the explosion could have been much worse. At the time of the explosion, they were driving fuse. Yet, strange to say, while a large quantity of fixed ammunition was close by, there was but little damage done to the material except in the immediate neighborhood. Boxes and kegs of Forresco's wooden fuses were close by, and numbers upon numbers of loaded bombs and shrapnel shot, and all remained unharmed. The men of the establishment, after slightly recovering from their alarm, rushed for the water sources and, finding the building on fire, poured in bucket after bucket of water and succeeded in extinguishing the flames. The magazine is situated within some 6 or 8 feet of the house, and yet it was not injured in the least. It is indeed remarkable, considering the number of males and females who were working there at the time, and the large amount of explosive material all around, that the loss and suffering was so little. This accident again prompted the editors of the paper to call for change. The girls engaged in the next building, the cartridge factory, rushed out, terribly alarmed, but none of them were injured. This, we believe, is the 3rd explosion which has occurred in this city, and we hope that some means may be devised to prevent a recurrence of these dreadful accidents. And the answer was a new facility, the dispatch reported on January 31st. It is gratifying to learn that no death has resulted from the recent explosion of fuses in the CS laboratory, and that all the boys who were injured are in a fair way to recover. The government is now doing what ought to have been done in the first place, constructing a building on the upper extremity of Brown's Island, where all this work of driving fuses will be carried on. There will be then, we presume, no reason for apprehending another explosion in the laboratory proper. Brown's Island is in the James River, named after Elijah Brown, who acquired the land in 1826. Brown's Island was also the location of the Tredegar Iron Works, the largest in the Confederacy. The Brown's Island facility consisted, the dispatch writes in 1863, of a large number of long and short low wooden houses, used for the preparation and manufacture of ammunition for small arms. The facility was important to the Confederacy. Historian Robert M. Dunkerley quoted a newspaper of the era on the website of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. The establishment has been of inestimable service, we may say the salvation of the Confederacy. It is the general ordnance manufactory of the South. Dunkerley writes the laboratory's workers could produce 200,000 small-arm cartridges a day, or about 1,200,000 a week. Those numbers sound impressive, but the Army's need for ammunition was never-ending. For a major battle, the Army of Northern Virginia required about 5 million small arms cartridges and 40,000 rounds of artillery ammunition. But although that article claimed very few accidents have occurred at the lab since its establishment, much fewer indeed than might reasonably have been expected where so many raw hands have been necessarily employed, accidents certainly continued to occur. The dispatch reported the death of a worker in August of 1862 when a large mass of fulminating powder exploded in the wooden house used for its manufacture on Brown's Island in James River at the foot of 7th Street. The nature of the danger of the work showed in the disposition of the remains of the deceased worker, one William Pratt, with the dispatch reporting one arm of the unfortunate Pratt was picked up some distance from the scene of the tragedy. The other was not found. His body was otherwise terribly mutilated and parts missing. The paper noted, "This is the 3rd time an explosion of like material, attended with fatal results, has occurred here, and it would appear that no amount of precaution suffices to guard against casualties of such a kind." The deaths were even more frightening given the risks of loss of life at the Brown's Island Works. The dispatch noted the island is occupied in the day by between 300 and 400 operatives, nearly all girls or women. The website History of American Women explains because most of Richmond's men were serving their country at the front, women and children were the bulk of the workforce at Confederate States Laboratory, from the age of 12 to 60. Their hands were small and well suited to assembling cartridges, fuses, caps, and primers for the Confederate Army. Working at peak efficiency, even a child as young as 9 could turn out up to 1,200 cartridges per day. Dunkerley opines, with so many laboring in such a sprawling complex and lacking the modern training and safety guidelines in place today, an accident was bound to happen. That accident occurred on March 13th, 1863. The Richmond Examiner reported that at first the disaster was hard to distinguish from among the other sounds of the city during the war. Between 11 and 12 o'clock yesterday morning, some fixed the time at exactly 20 minutes past 11 o'clock, a dull, prolonged roar in the direction of Brown's Island across the James River from the foot of 7th Street startled that portion of the city and directed attention to the island, on which is located the Confederate Laboratory Works for the manufacture of percussion caps and gun cartridges. But similar-sounding explosions, arising from the trial of ordnance at the Tredegar Iron Works, had been daily heard in that neighborhood, and it was some minutes before a dense smoke arising from the island apprised the citizens of the true cause of the explosion. The dispatch reports, on proceeding to the spot, as several thousand persons did from fear of appalling accident, the disaster was found to have occurred on Brown's Island. The blast was a scene of chaos. The dispatch reported about 50 feet of the building was destroyed. The exact manner in which the explosion occurred is not known. Owing to the small quantity of powder in the room, the house, which was about 20 feet wide, was not blown to pieces, but from the accumulation of gas from the exploding powder, the walls were forced outward and the roof fell in. Crushed under its weight the 60 or 70 inmates who were at work therein. The door connecting the pistol cartridge room with the room destroyed was blown away. Directly the explosion was heard, a scene of the direst confusion ensued on the island. Some of the girls in their fright ran from the adjacent buildings and plunged into the river. The Richmond Inquirer reported the department is located on Brown's Island, opposite the foot of 7th Street, and in it all breech loading and pistol ammunition is prepared. The greatest care has hitherto been observed in keeping the stock of ammunition safely confined, but through some so far inexplicable circumstance, the powder used by some of the operatives in the department ignited about the time above indicated, and exploded with a terrific report, tearing down half the building, and killing, wounding, and throwing in the air or upon the floor the operatives who were engaged in their labors. There were in the building some 80 or 100 hands, chiefly females of different ages, from 12 to 60 years. Among those injured, the dispatch noted, was the Reverend John Woodcock, who had charge of a portion of the works on the island. The Richmond Sentinel called Woodstock a local preacher in the Methodist Church and a most exemplary man in all relations of life. Woodcock died the following day. The scene, it appears, was beyond the dispatch's ability to describe. We purposely omit any description of the scene likely to add additional food for horrid images. The reality in this case was bad enough. The shrieks of the wounded and plaintive moans of the dying, together with the agonized looks of those who had relatives on the island, rendered it a scene not likely to be forgotten. The Inquirer merely said, the scene so terrible, so sickening, we need not essay to depict to our readers. The city quickly mobilized, with the Inquirer writing, the alarm of fire was given and the report spread through the city with rapidity, and within an hour the banks of the river very opposite the island were densely thronged with citizens. Very soon, under the direction of officers of the laboratory, spring wagons and carriages were brought to the spot, and the work of removing the wounded to their homes and elsewhere was commenced. In the meantime, the medical department was alive with promptitude and energy, and none of the wounded were removed until their condition had received the best temporary attention. All day the work of taking care of the sufferers went on. 10 were killed by the explosion at the time of its occurrence, and others are reported to have died during the day, while it is not expected that half of the survivors will recover. Most of the latter were removed to their homes. While initially the cause of the accident was unclear, surprisingly the full details would come out. The Richmond Sentinel wrote, "It now appears probable, from investigations made by the proper authorities, that the terrible disaster at the government laboratory on Brown's Island last Friday was caused by the accidental ignition of a friction primer in the hands of a girl named Mary Ryan, who possibly did not observe sufficient precaution in the work upon which she was employed." The website of Richmond National Battlefield Park writes, Mary Ryan was born in Ireland, but by the late 1860s she lived in Richmond with her family on Bird Street, not far from the Tredegar Iron Works in the industrial area along Richmond's waterfront. During the Civil War, Ryan worked in the Confederate laboratory on Brown's Island, along with many other women and girls, helping to support their families. At the laboratory, they prepared artillery and small arms ammunition, a vital part of the Confederate war effort. Most were paid $1 or $2 a day. Ryan's father, Michael, worked at the Tredegar Iron Works as a laborer, and her mother, Mary, worked as a house servant. There were 4 other sisters and 2 brothers in the family. All were born in Ireland, and all but Michael were illiterate. Ryan had been working with friction primers, used to ignite the powder in a muzzle-loading cannon. Dunkerley writes on the website Emerging Civil War. She had been previously corrected for being careless with her work. On this day, she was working with artillery friction primers, brass tubes with explosive chemicals inside. Mary was working with a wooden block that held the primers and removing them one by one. They sometimes got stuck, and in her frustration, she rapped the block on the table to loosen them. The National Battlefield Park website writes, severely burned, Ryan was taken to the nearby home of a friend, Emily Timberlake on Bird Street. Another victim, Elizabeth Young, was also brought there to recover. Here, Ryan was interviewed by investigators about the accident and admitted her actions. She noted that she banged the primers on the table 3 times. Then it exploded. Gorgas himself did that interview. A military report assigned the cause to the young woman, but by the time the report was issued, she had perished. The Sentinel reported Mary Ryan, the young girl in whose hands exploded the friction cannon primer, causing the terrible disaster at the government laboratory, died of her injuries at her father's house on Oregon Hill on Monday. 1 or 2 others are reported as having expired since Sunday. On the 16th, the dispatch wrote, the loss of life by the dreadful explosion at the laboratory on Browns Island on Friday last proves far greater than was even at first supposed. Up to 3 o'clock yesterday, the explosion had proved fatal to 33 of those engaged at work at the scene of the disaster. This is a result dreadful to think of, carrying as it does the seeds to never-dying anguish in the bosoms of many families in our midst. Dunkerley writes that of the 64 workers who were injured in the explosion, fully 50 of them died. The remains of one worker, Martha Burley, were only discovered downstream in the James River a month after the explosion. The community mourned, funds were raised for the families of the victims, funerals went on for weeks, but History of American Women notes, despite the fact that they gave their lives for their country, the victims of the Browns Island disaster were soon forgotten, as Richmond returned to the grim business of supplying the soldiers in the field. Many of the victims were buried in unmarked paupers' graves, nearly forgotten casualties of the war between the states, who deserve to be remembered. On September 15, 2001, members of the Virginia Division of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Virginia Division of the Children of the Confederacy dedicated a monument at Richmond's Oakwood Cemetery to the victims of the Browns Island explosion. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. There's another cat, so I have to put you down. Can't have other cats.